Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and a professor in our Department of Government and School of Foreign Service. And on behalf of the entire university community, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conference today on current challenges in refugee policy. Thank you so much for being here. I think you'll agree that on this topic in particular, we have more than enough challenges to fill an entire day. And our conference organizers, Catherine Donato, Director of our Institute for the Study of International Migration, Sean Casey, Director of our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and their teams have put together an excellent program. In a moment, I'll turn it over to Catherine to introduce our topic and program in more detail. But first, just a couple of words about the university context for our gathering. This, as you'll know from the literature, is the culminating conference of our university-wide Global Refugee and Migration Project, a project generously supported by Georgetown's Board of Regents. I want to recognize Kojo Mills, Vice Chair of the Global Engagement Committee of the board, and thank him and his colleagues for their generous support. That support has enabled an interconnected series of activities over the past 18 months, conferences like this one, a policy consultation with recommendations, a student fellows program, and a set of publications, including a policy brief and a forthcoming special issue of a leading journal. The project is part of a wider approach to global here at Georgetown. Of course, we want to continue to excel as a global university that sends students and faculty out into the world, that engages in partnerships and academic exchanges. But we also want to be a place, a platform for a conversation around the critical global issues of our time. Here in Washington, D.C., really benefiting from our deep involvement and access to national and international policy networks. So this project and the broader approach of which it's a part is an effort to promote scholarship, but also to advance better policy in collaboration with and conversation with practitioners from the public, private, and NGO sectors. So with the help of the Regents, with the leadership of Catherine, Sean, and their teams, this project in particular has been working to highlight local responses to the international refugee and migration crisis, perhaps the greatest transnational and humanitarian challenge of our time. We've worked to advance the conversation about how we can learn from what works across national and local contexts and what doesn't work around the world. That's a conversation you've joined today, a conversation many of you have engaged with us and with others in the past, and a conversation we hope will continue, must continue in the years to come. And Georgetown, as a Jesuit university committed to the global common good, wants to continue to be a leader and a convener in this area. So thanks again for joining us. And please join me in welcoming my colleague, Catherine Donato, who will introduce the shared work we'll be tackling today. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. We're really quite excited to welcome you today to this conference on refugees and migrants. My name is Catherine Donato. I'm the Donald Hertzberg Chair of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service, as well as Director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration. Today's event is, as Tom suggested, the last of the three big events that we had organized as part of the Global Refugee and Migration Project. It is really, it's been a very fun and productive 16 months so far. This is an initiative that was inspired and supported by the Regents Committee on Global Engagement, and for that we are very grateful. This project has really allowed us to do something that we haven't done before, which is to build on ISOM's, our institute's expertise on refugees and migration, and combine that expertise with the institutional support from the Berkley Center to advance research and policy on this topic. You will see today that the project really leverages ISOM and Berkeley together, as well as leverages, our great location of being inside the Beltway here in DC, our extensive university interests in the global, and as well the Jesuit mission of service. The strategic focus today really builds out of the last 16 months. Today's conference is, we've organized on various themes on migrants and refugees, or on refugees and migration, and these themes are themes that we at ISOM and at Berkeley are exploring or would like to explore moving forward in terms of research and developing policy initiatives from that research. So you'll hear a lot about ongoing research projects. You'll hear related to both of our institutions here at the university, but you will also hear from outsiders that we've invited in for them to share their expertise on these specific questions that we're focused on today, discussing. I think that really, truly, this project has allowed us at ISOM and at Berkeley to move our work to the next level and to establish Georgetown as a leader on this increasingly important topic, a topic that all estimates suggest is going to be of growing importance and growing, certainly, relevance to nation states around the world, and generally speaking, to all kinds of global initiatives and activities. Today we will start this morning with before lunch, with two sessions. One will be on best practices for children on the move, and the second will be about forced migration and what religion has to do with it. Then at lunchtime, we have the great honor of hearing from the president of Refugees International, Eric Schwartz, who will be joining us for the lunch plenary. We'll have a bit of a break after that, and then do another two sessions, one on immigration court and procedural justice in the United States. And then we will consider in the last session the future of refugee resettlement policy. So welcome, enjoy the day. Everything will happen in this room, lunch, the plenary. There'll be refreshments throughout the day. If you need anything, you certainly know Tom and I are here, but also a special thanks to Claudia and to Ruth. I don't know where Claudia is. I know you're in the room somewhere. There you are, all the way back there. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Ruth, for making all the details actually happen for today and keep pushing us so that we get it all ready to go. So thank you to them, and they too will be here all day in case anyone has any questions. So thank you. With that, let's start with the first session, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Elizabeth Ferris, who is a research professor here at ISOM, and she will moderate the first session.
Come on up. Well, good morning, everyone, and again, add my words of welcome to those who've come before. I am delighted that we're starting with the issue of children, refugee and migrant children. I'm sure most of you who've been reading headlines over the past year have read about the crisis on the U.S.-Mexico border, where large numbers of children have arrived, and really a whole series of policy developments that have limited their ability to get protection, to be treated with dignity, and so on. But you know, these aren't just U.S. issues. Last summer, I did a lecture tour in India for the State Department on global migration. It was one of those trips where you give 5 or 6 talks a day to diplomats and students and business and military. Every single meeting I had, the first question was, is it true the U.S. is really separating kids at the border? What happens in the U.S. has implications for countries around the world. And as we'll see in this panel, some of the practices around refugee and migrant children, children who show up on a border, are certainly a cause for concern, not just in the U.S. or those crossing the Mediterranean and arriving in Europe, or those migrating in other parts of the world. But it's something for us to think about as we look at the future of this international refugee and migration regime. So we're going to start by looking at the U.S.-Mexico border, and we'll start with Maria Odom from the KIND, the Kids in Need of Defense, which has provided high-quality legal assistance to children in detention. And we'll hear from her about how their work has expanded just from the United States to other countries, particularly in Central America and Mexico. Then we'll turn to Ashley Peasley from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, a Migration and Refugee Service, where she's a senior policy advisor and has worked for many years on legal issues, again around refugee and migrant children once they arrive in the United States, having worked with Clinic and other organizations. So that's great. I hope you guys admire the gender balance we've achieved on this panel. It doesn't always happen at Georgetown, but every once in a while. So we'll start by looking at issues around the U.S. Policies toward refugee and migrant children. And then we're going to step back and look globally. And here we're thrilled to have 2 of our undergraduate students. We have Lauren Olosky and Morgan Smith, who've been working for the past year or so on issues around global practices of refugee and migrant children. Really looking at, we can criticize a lot about things that are going wrong. What should we be advocating for? What are good practices and policies? And they'll report on a student initiative we did this year where we took a group of students to Sweden. Sweden, probably the most child-friendly country in the world in terms of its policies, to look at how they treat refugee and migrant children. And can any of the lessons learned there be applicable to other countries? So they'll talk a little bit about some of the good practices we found. But we're delighted you're here and looking forward to our discussion. We'll start with Maria Odom from KIND.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome. Good morning. Good morning. Well, I thought I'd give you a practitioner's perspective. At KIND, we represent unaccompanied children who face immigration court alone. As you know, they are not entitled to government-appointed counsel. And KIND was founded on the premise that we would leverage private sector resources and working with both law firms and corporations to build capacity for representation for unaccompanied children. Our programs have expanded into other areas, including a return and reintegration programming in Central America, as well as sex and gender-based violence prevention work in the Northern Triangle countries. We have recently expanded programming into certain areas of Europe, but I'm going to focus my remarks today on a number of things. I'd like to take us back a little bit to where we've been, during the past administration, the current, and where we are now, the progression of the various policies that have been implemented since January 2017, and their impact to unaccompanied children. And then I'll talk about our recent assessments. I spent a lot of time at the southern border in the last 9 months with my colleagues, conducting a number of assessments of the conditions impacting unaccompanied children, children on the move, coming through Mexico and to the northern border. So if we go back to the Obama era, we did face a number of challenges. You hear probably a lot of people saying, well, there was family separation during Obama. There were kids in cages, as people like to say, during the Obama administration. And I don't think we can gloss over the challenges that existed during that administration, particularly around the 2014 surge. The numbers sort of went up drastically. Some of you may know we saw over 68,000 unaccompanied minors arrive in the U.S. in 2014, which was the highest it ever been. The system was not prepared for that surge. And of course, there were concerns, significant concerns over conditions, of detention and processing of those children. There was family detention that was rolled out at the same time. A number of what the government calls family units were arriving. And Obama administration grappled with that surge of arrivals by expanding family detention, which many of us here opposed, and it was not a sustainable approach to processing and serving, particularly mothers and small children who were arriving at the time. There were raids that were threatened and some that were carried out, and detention of unaccompanied minors with final orders of removal. And of course, we struggled with court backlogs and asylum processing backlogs as well, other adjudicatory issues that during my time at the Department of Homeland Security, we grappled with significantly, particularly around asylum processing and the protections that are afforded to unaccompanied children so that they have a fair shot at applying for asylum in a less restrictive setting. There were some good things that happened too. The administration rolled out the Central American Minors Program in an effort to afford a safe passage, a protocol for children fleeing certain countries in Central America to come to the United States. There were significant investments on the legal services side. The Justice AmeriCorps program was launched with funding to provide direct representation to children who were unaccompanied, as well as a decision to provide funding for direct representation of children through the Office for Refugee Resettlement to complement the investments that were being made with appropriations for pro bono support for those children. So that was a big deal to the field. And finally, there were some efforts, and Ashley, you may be able to weigh in on this later if folks are interested, to implement some alternatives to detention programming. I think there were significant challenges in getting ICE to cooperate, to afford families with most small children other opportunities rather than family detention. And then Donald Trump is elected and sworn into office, and immediately in January of 2017, he issues executive orders. You may recall the Muslim ban, and with that came other policies that were promised. And then, interestingly, the rhetoric began to address unaccompanied children as opportunistic, and the laws that protect them as loopholes. In June of 2017, so just a mere few months after President Trump was sworn into office, the Justice AmeriCorps program ends, and sponsors begin to be targeted. The people who are supposed to step up to take custody of the children were then threatened with detention and removal if they didn't have legal status here in the U.S. Immediately that fall, we saw an effort by the administration to redefine the term unaccompanied minor on their own terms, as opposed to what the law indicates is supposed to be an unaccompanied minor for children who arrived before the age of 18 but turned 18 during the process. In light of all those backlogs, the administration started messaging to immigration judges that those children upon turning 18 would no longer be considered unaccompanied minors. Also, instructing judges to consider reunification with at least one parent to deem those children no longer unaccompanied. And the legal implications have been significant for those children who are no longer deemed unaccompanied. Those protections are important because children often take a long time to tell their story. They need the time to process trauma, to receive psychosocial support, to feel trust with a legal provider, to find a legal provider. So at times, when juveniles arrive shortly before turning 18, it is assumed that they're prepared to move forward with their cases alone, and very often, more often than not, in fact, they're not. So that was a significant development for us, given the backlogs and the age of our over almost 7,000 clients that we have at the moment. We also started seeing less child-friendly courts. Juvenile dockets in many jurisdictions in immigration court have been disbanded. Having a ceremonial courtroom that was no longer being used for day-to-day hearings to be able to conduct Know Your Rights presentations were no longer accessible to attorneys in places like New York City, where a coalition of service providers working with unaccompanied minors would go in and work with the children who were appearing on their own to advise them of their rights. And I'm going somewhere with this. I'm giving you the trajectory because we're still talking about the fall of 2017, where we're seeing already all these changes that are later going to impact children's ability to apply for protection. At the same time, in March of 2017, KIND started reporting on separations, family separations at the border. In June of 2017, we're also seeing that the government started taking longer to reunify children who were in custody because of their policies and their collaboration, the collaboration between the Office for Refugee Resettlement and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that's important because that was the first time that there was a memorandum of understanding between the two agencies, which created a disincentive for parents and legal guardians to step forward to claim custody of that child, given the fear of deportation. That had happened in the past, but not through a formal sharing of fingerprint and biometrics information. At the same time, the Central American Minors Program was terminated, and now it's been addressed in the courts, and other adjudicatory issues related to asylum applications by children and special immigrant juvenile visas also ensued. And it continues, right? And now it takes us to the summer where we all, I think all of us, many of us up here, dealt with the response to the zero tolerance policy that was formally put into place by this administration and the ensuing thousands of separations that happened throughout the summer and that continue to this day. At that time, KIND stepped in and with a coalition of national and local service providers worked with over 800 separated children that were an average of 8 to 9 years of age. The complexity of that response, I think, still haunts many of us to this day, especially for organizations like KIND that works on both sides of the border. And we were tasked with finding the deported parents and helping with the reunification of very small children. I think it did damage, long-term, forever damage to those families, but also I think the field took a big hit, as we say, by having to process the trauma of working with the small children who couldn't understand what happened, and also the parents who were in custody. And proceeding from there, we have seen a number of policies as that you've heard in the news and read about. The Migrant Protection Protocol, most significantly, that has forced over 60,000 asylum seekers to remain in Mexico. We have seen a number of policies at the border now, including the third safe country agreements that have been signed. Less formally, I think some of us will contest, and the courts will have to decide whether they are third safe country agreements per se, but third safe country arrangements that they have made. At the same time, with Guatemala and Honduras, and El Salvador, and we'll talk about the impacts of those policies in a minute. So shifting towards the border, just to give you a sense of the numbers, for the year 2019, the apprehensions will hit a historical high again for unaccompanied children. As of the end of August, we were at 77,108 unaccompanied children. That's just as of August versus the 68,000 high of 2014. However, by July, some of the policies that have been, the migration control measures that have been put into place by Mexico and the US were already starting to result in lower numbers. There are several factors that have contributed to that. We talked about the Migrant Protection Protocol very briefly. The heavy militarization of both the Mexican southern border with the new National Guard, as well as in certain parts of the northern border in places like Ciudad Juarez, have also contributed to forced returns without protection screenings. What have we observed? There has been a progression of, I think, actions on the part of the Mexican government in response to the United States implementing the Migrant Protection Protocol. back in December, there were a significant number of migrants waiting in Tijuana. And when we did our first assessment in Tijuana, we found several things. We found that unaccompanied minors were not being given access to the U.S. ports of entry and were being blocked by Mexican authorities through the use of private security forces. This is December of 2018. So access was impeded. Unaccompanied children were being forced to put their names on the metering list, which was the predecessor to the Migrant Protection Protocol, and now they're both kind of running in parallel. Migrants will, sign the list and then wait to be processed. CBP controls the number of people who can approach the port of entry. Those measures are still in place. While the administration stated that they do not apply to unaccompanied children, the reality on the ground in December was, and still remains to an extent, that unaccompanied children were being forced to sign on lists to present at the port of entry. Often were not allowed to get on the list by the migrants who were running the list. The chaos that ensued in a place like Tijuana, given the insurmountable challenges of supporting the number of migrants that were living on the streets, really put children in great peril. On the CBP side, we also saw turnbacks. We saw officers who just blatantly refused entry to the children. And to wrap up, because I think I'm reaching my time here, what we have seen is a progression of these policies driving migrant children more underground, to civil society shelters, trying to evade Mexican state shelters. And I'm happy to talk about KIND's work with building capacity with the child welfare officials in Mexico. Our goal is to help children on the move in Mexico understand their rights both to seek protection in Mexico and to liaise with the US government and the Mexican government for best interest determinations that take into account US protection as an option, and that we can provide safe preparation and accompaniment in partnership with governments to those children where they need to go. In the meantime, we'll continue to monitor the southern Mexican border and work with partners there to prevent more repatriations, which is what continues to happen at the southern border. So I expect the numbers will continue to go down because of repatriations at the southern border, and there are going to be significant legal implications for unaccompanied kids because of the third state country issues.
Well, thank you very much for that depressing overview of what's happening on our southern border. I mean, I really admire practitioners who are working every day with these policies that are constantly changing. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the statistics are something like a person with a lawyer is 5 times more likely to get asylum than somebody who doesn't have legal counsel. And so the work of providing legal assistance is really, really, really key. We'll turn now to Ashley Feasley from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops.
First off, thank you so much for having me, and I think it's wonderful that Georgetown's been working on this initiative. I have a backgrounder on the table where you registered. It's a frequently asked questions about unaccompanied children, and it just gives some general overview and highlights some of the numbers that Maria mentioned. I wanted to give just a quick overview as to who the USCCB Migration Refugee Services Office is, what we do. I'm going to give a little bit about, throw some numbers at you about the Unaccompanied Children's Program, and then I'm going to quickly walk you through the process that the majority of unaccompanied children experience when they arrive at the US-Mexico border. So very quickly, the Migration Refugee Services Office at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is a direct service component. We provide, in partnership with the federal government, family reunification of unaccompanied children, and then small-scale shelters, foster care, transitional and long-term foster care, and then specialized care for pregnant and parenting teens, and also disabled unaccompanied children as well. Last year, we provided family reunification services for about 1,100 unaccompanied children. And again, we provide continuous small-scale shelters, and we do that in partnership with the federal government. Interestingly enough, Maria mentioned the family separation. We were also requested personally by the Trump administration, along with our partner Lutheran Immigrant Refugee Services, to help reunify the separated families that was required by the Miss L litigation. And so last summer, we, along with LIRS, reunified approximately 1,200 family units. The Catholic Network reunified approximately 900 of those family units. And there's a report on our website about the work that was done. I cannot say enough to Maria's point about the work that was done, I think, not only from practitioners on the ground, but also, frankly, the day-to-day efforts of HHS and DHS on the ground employees who were really scrambling, I think, to implement, the reality of reunification, regardless of the policy itself. So I'm going to give you a couple numbers to give you a contour of the Unaccompanied Children program. As Maria mentioned, this fiscal year is the highest number of unaccompanied children that the United States has seen. We're at, the calculations are not formalized yet, but we're at about 79,000 unaccompanied children who were apprehended by CBP, which is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. Currently, we have about 4,000 children who are in care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. This summer, we had a high of about 13,000 children who were in ORR care. Currently, we're seeing about 45 days that children stay with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And as a result of some of the policies that Maria mentioned, earlier in the spring, we were seeing up to 90, 95 days that children would stay in ORR care. So these are just some of the statistics I think that are important to understand when you think about frankly, the fluctuating situation with unaccompanied children. There are a lot of policies and there's a lot of factors that change why children will come. Despite the politicization that they are looking for loopholes, we know that a lot of the children that we interview, they're coming because of, frankly, root cause issues. They're coming due to violence. They're coming due to family breakdown, economic insecurity, sometimes climate change related economic insecurity. And it's very cyclical as a migration pattern that we then see certain policies that frankly exacerbate or stress the system. So I wanted to just walk through briefly what happens to the majority of unaccompanied children who arrive at the US-Mexico border. The large majority of unaccompanied children that we're seeing are not from Mexico or Canada, so they are known as unaccompanied children from non-contiguous countries. And the largest number that we see are from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the Northern Triangle. When an unaccompanied child from one of those countries or any country not Mexico or Canada comes up to the US-Mexico border, and that's where most of them come, they are encountered by Customs and Border Protection, who is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. Most instances, these children are not apprehended, they're asking for assistance. They are turned over to CBP, normally uniformed officers who find them along the border, sometimes a little bit further out, sometimes within the US territory. And they normally spend a small amount of time, in theory, in a CBP border shelter. They're not supposed to spend more than 72 hours in those facilities, and that is codified in law in the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act. The idea here is those shelters are not made for children. They were not created for children. They were not created for families. They were created, in many instances, a while ago for a much more adult and frankly, male, nimble kind of population. And so the law there is that they're not supposed to stay more than 72 hours. When that works right, they're transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. So this is the office that is tasked with the actual care of unaccompanied children while they're here in the United States and while we look for them to reunify with suitable family members or sponsors. I want to point out something very carefully. So the Department of Homeland Security is that first point in touch, a law enforcement agency. They're then transferred to Health and Human Services, which is not a law enforcement agency. Instead, it's a social welfare agency. Once they're in Health and Human Services, they're taken to a number of shelters. There's a network of shelters around the United States of various size, various types, various, frankly, controls for different populations. While they're there, they work with social workers that are, in some instances, they're Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, USCRI, different voluntary agencies who work on this issue to help reunify them with families. The family reunification process happens after a vetting process where we look at the sponsors, normally mom and dad or a guardian, but there can be other sponsors. We do assessments as to the suitability for them to be reunified, and we also look at kind of how to ensure that that placement is good. Now, I mentioned to you a statistic about how we're looking at about 45 days that this process is taking now. But in the summer, we were seeing anywhere from 75 to 95 days. Why were we seeing so much? Well, Maria mentioned this policy, the Memorandum of Agreement, which was an information sharing agreement between DHS, a law enforcement agency, and HHS that basically allowed information that was collected in what had been, for the most part, a confidential process to try and ensure family reunification, was now becoming something that information could be turned over to the Department of Homeland Security's Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Office, and possibly, submit that certain sponsors could be eligible for removal or apprehension. Now, this created a ripple of fear in the community, and it created for us service providers a real difficulty in ensuring that we could get the right parents, sponsors to come forward, particularly if they were undocumented. We know that a large percentage, over 80% of the sponsors, so parents and guardians, who are reunifying with their children who have been unaccompanied are indeed undocumented. We've seen some of those policies, part of that MOA that's been kind of rewritten to be, frankly, more responsive to the reality of who unaccompanied children and their families actually are and what their needs are. And as a result, I think we've seen an improvement in the amount of time that children are in ORR custody. So once a vetting has occurred for the parent or sponsor of an unaccompanied child, and that the child has gone through all the necessary screening, family reunification occurs. And they occur all throughout the country. One of the things, though, that we see and that we continually work at with other immigration service providers is the continued need for care. So once this family has been reunited, the children need immigration legal service assistance, which is not provided by the federal government. We also see a high need for skills, and skills-based learning, but also, therapeutic efforts at counseling, social assistance, school enrollment. These are all things that children who have been reunified and are now in the United States with their family, pending their immigration court proceedings, what they need. And I will say to you that this remains a constant struggle. This was a struggle with the Obama administration, and it remains a struggle for the Trump administration. We strongly believe that these types of services, so post-release services or home studies where someone comes into a home to assess the suitability, or follow-up, like I said, therapy, social services, access to legal services. These are things that are constantly in need, and these are things that, frankly, we should be advocating for just for the well-being of the children who are here in the United States. And I just want to say for a moment, it's not just for the well-being of the United States, but it's sound fiscal and, frankly, I would say security policy. Children who receive these services, they are more likely to comply with their immigration proceedings. They are more likely to be, on the path to success and integration in the United States. And so we do really feel that this is something that I think is very important to understand. I do just want to say one thing about the children themselves that we see. I mentioned to you that a lot of them, they're not paying attention to whatever rhetoric is being said about them, about loopholes or trying to take advantage of the system. These are children who have frankly traveled thousands of miles by themselves without any sort of larger design as to making it here for status. I think we see children who are increasingly afraid to be and remain in their community. They are afraid to stay. They're facing gang recruitment. They're facing situations where they may be willfully extorted, or their grandparents, in many instances, who are their caretakers, can no longer care for them or can no longer pay the renta that's being required by a gang, controlled influence in their neighborhood. So, while I think it's important for us to talk about the policies, I think we always need to remember that these are children that we're talking about, and all of the policies that we're debating and giving recommendations for must be focused from a child lens and with a best interest determination to ensure that the children that we're serving here, whether they remain here with legal status or whether they are returned to their home country, receive the best care possible.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for really completing the picture of what happens at the border and what happens to these kids who are then moved elsewhere in the United States. We're going to turn now and look at some good practices because we didn't want this to be too depressing. And we're going to ask Lauren and Morgan to report on good practices used globally in terms of responding to refugee and migrant children. Please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're so excited to be here, and today, as Professor Ferris mentioned, we'll be giving a more optimistic look at best practices grounded in the research that we have been doing, looking at 10 different case studies in various regions around the world, and distilling that for you today into some of the best practices and how those are applied in practice on the ground.
To give you a sense of the numbers of children on the move around the world, there are roughly 36 million migrant children worldwide and nearly 14 million refugee children. The refugee population is very young. Around 52% of all refugees are children, compared to the average population in which only around a quarter are below the age of 18. We see that's a really, really high proportion. You can see in the graphic that there is some regional variation. Africa has the highest proportion of refugees that are children at almost 60%. But broadly, what this means is that immigration and refugee policies have an outsized impact on children. And so when we're debating these policies, when we're developing these policies, it's really important we take into account the best interests of the child in all cases. So we'll move to a few best practices that we've distilled. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's not exactly revolutionary, but it is really important, which is ending child detention. So according to the UN, there are currently around 330,000 children in migration detention per year worldwide. We know this is probably a low figure because most countries don't prefer to divulge the number of children they're detaining. But regardless, at face value, it's still way too high. Only 21 countries have expressly prohibited child detention for migration purposes, so there's a big room for improvement here. And the alternative to child detention that we found when we were looking at these different cases was creating child-friendly shelters for short-term arrival and processing. And Sweden has developed a very innovative model for this called Barnlanda. Barn means child and landa means rest and recuperation. And essentially they're very warm environments, child-friendly shelters where once an unaccompanied minor arrives in Sweden, this is where they're first taken and this is where they stay until they are put in long-term accommodation. And it's also the place where they meet all the different actors in the child protection system that are working with them. That's the Barnahus idea, which is the idea that all the actors come to the child and meet in a central location, which is the Barnlanda. So it's clearly a very stark alternative to the child detention, which we're used to seeing, but also a clear improvement.
So best interest determinations are a key component of any comprehensive child protection system. And they are based around the idea that any action should give primary but not sole consideration to the best interest of the child. And bids provide a framework for determining and assessing these interests, which can range from safety to physical well-being and health, to family integrity and unity, to culture and identity, and ultimately, perhaps of most paramount importance, taking into consideration the expressed views and opinions of the child themselves. So if the child is of an age and maturity where they're able to express what they believe is their own best interest, that should be given its due weight and consideration. And these bids were a gold standard to emerge from the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, and in best case should be implemented at various inflection points throughout the asylum process. For example, taking into consideration guardianship or school enrollment, durable solutions, long-term accommodation, essentially any action that could have far-reaching implications for that child. Our next best practice is training officials on child protection in order to increase their capacity to, firstly, recognize signs of abuse and neglect, and secondly, to mitigate the risks that children might be exposed to that can range from labor exploitation to sexual and gender-based violence to human trafficking. And we chose here to focus on law enforcement officers, government agencies, NGO workers, social welfare officers, essentially any local actor on the ground who is in close contact with a child and has an opportunity to promote their well-being. In terms of this playing out on the ground, we see in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar that Rohingya children are often vulnerable, especially to sexual and gender-based violence and to human trafficking. And UNICEF and UNHCR co-launched a program in December of last year, actually, to increase the capacity and technical expertise of particularly local NGO workers to be well-knowledged in comprehensive child protection case management. And so this was co-launched with a system in this child protection management, and then these two partnerships sought to build the expertise of these officers in carrying out this training. And then turning more to look at healthcare. So a best practice is that healthcare should be both comprehensive and equal access. Equal access here implying that refugee and migrant children enjoy similar or the same benefits as local or native-born children in their host country. And comprehensive meaning that they can access a wide range of services and welfare beyond just emergency services, particularly looking at sexual and reproductive health care for young women and girls, and mental health care, which is of course highly important for refugee children who have experienced trauma, as mentioned by both Marie and Ashley, and are at an increased risk of PTSD and other psychosocial problems that can potentially stunt their socio-emotional and cognitive development, as well as inhibit their integration into their host country. And we see that in Turkey, under Turkish law, refugee children that have been registered, particularly Syrian children, are able to access the same primary and secondary healthcare services as local Turkish children and incur no cost. So this includes public hospitals, mobile clinics, resources that are available both in refugee camps and in urban settings.
Education is obviously a crucial aspect of ensuring that a refugee or migrant child is able to be successful in the destination country, but unfortunately millions of these children are out of school. The figure that UNHCR gives is 4 million refugee children, but that's out of the 7 million that they monitor. There are many more that are not monitored. There are many asylum-seeking children and migrant children that are also out of school. But it's safe to say the number is in the millions, which is far too high. And while there are different barriers to access, and we can't get into all of them, the one we've chosen to present is a pretty straightforward fix, which is removing documentation requirements for education enrollment. Essentially, most schools in both wealthy and poor nations require that kids enroll in school with different documentation. It could be a birth certificate, identity proof, proof of residency, immunization records, or school transcripts from the past. And for refugee and migrant children, these can be really difficult to obtain, especially unaccompanied minors often don't have access to these documents at all. And in the time it takes to secure the documents, it's time that a child's out of school. And so what Italy did in 2015 is they completely scrapped their proof of residency requirement for education enrollment in favor of self-declarations in which a child can present themselves at school, say, this is who I am, I'd like to enroll, and they would be enrolled. And so that really paved the way to get more refugee and migrant children into the classroom.
So refugee and migrant children may be out of formal education for weeks, months, or even years, especially if they're in protracted situations. And then upon arrival to their host countries, they are severely disadvantaged by these gaps in their formal education, as well as language barriers that inhibit them from thriving and integrating within their schools. And so these two best practices, we believe, really work best in tandem. The first, looking more closely at language. It's important, of course, to support the development of a child's understanding of the local language of their host country, because this facilitates integration and social cohesion and down the road for further employment opportunities. However, we believe it's also important, yet not as closely discussed and recognized, that a child's native or mother tongue language should be preserved as well, as this is inherent to their culture, their identity, and so steps should be taken to support bilingual education. In the Turkey example here, this project that was launched in 2016, among other things, hired Arabic and Turkish teachers to offer language instruction in both languages, and we see that in the program statistics, within 2 years of its launch in 2016, it in fact doubled the enrollment of Syrian children within the Turkish education system, which underlines its broad success. And then looking more closely at accelerated learning programs, going back to the barriers and the gaps that children may have had in their formal education. In Canada's LEAP program, this targets specifically middle school students in Toronto in advanced literacy and fast-tracking these students by condensing 2 years of language and subject learning into one to facilitate their ultimate shift into mainstream classrooms by helping them catch up to where their peers are at.
Finally, the classroom is the place where foreign-born children interact with native-born children, and so it's really important that it is a place of inclusion and where cross-cultural understanding is fostered. And the most concrete way we've seen to ensure that this happens is by revising the curricula that is taught in the classroom. Côte d'Ivoire had a textbook reform where they rewrote the textbooks to include topics of diversity, conflict, and displacement and migration in particular. So that they, from grade 3, were teaching kids about these issues. They instilled a rights-based education. They directly teach about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and principles of non-discrimination, so that they can combat xenophobia at the core and in the classroom and make sure that children are, foreign-born children feel included in the discussion. This goes in tandem with training teachers, because obviously a good curriculum is useless if the teachers aren't equipped to discuss hard topics like these. So it's important that teachers are trained to foster the inclusion of foreign-born children, to combat xenophobia, know how to address prejudice when it comes up, to recognize and meet the needs of refugee and migrant children. We can't expect that they can just do this on their own. It's something that needs to be trained in their training. Guardianship is also hugely important for unaccompanied minors in particular. We see across the world that guardianship systems are lacking on a number of fronts. Either a child is not assigned a guardian at all, or they wait too long before they are assigned a guardian, or the guardian they're assigned is not monitored or screened, so they're able to neglect, abuse, and exploit the child. And so countries have a different number of ways of tackling this. The Netherlands has the NIDOS Foundation, which is a centralized agency that deals specifically with guardianship for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And because it's a centralized guardian, they are the legal guardian, and then they hire and train and screen and monitor all the professional guardians that they hire to take care of the children directly. And because it all occurs in one centralized institution, it's less likely that children will fall through the cracks, and it's more likely that the guardians will be able to be monitored and followed in their progress with the children.
And our final best practice for today is family unity, which has been broadly discussed up here already, but we believe, again, just to reinforce how essential that right is for children and how critical it is to their short and long-term development. And this can be challenged or undermined on two fronts. The first being, as families are fleeing persecution and conflict, they may become separated during that journey, or through the forcible, deliberate, and intentional practices of governments in host country, as we've seen at the US southern border. And so it's essential really to preserve this family unity for the well-being, safety, and rights of the child. And our final example here is Ecuador's Organic Law on Human Mobility, which was implemented in 2017. It enshrines the right to family unity for children and dictates that if it is determined through a best interest determination that family unity is the best outcome for a child or adolescent, then that should be the case, and parents should not be detained away from their children.
Thank you for listening. We hope some of these examples are interesting to you, and we look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, join me in thanking all of our panelists. Well, thanks to all of you for providing a wide overview of what's happening on the U.S. southern border, as well as some good practices from other parts of the world. The floor is now open for questions. We have about half an hour for discussion, which is also amazing for a Georgetown panel to have ample time for discussion. Yes, please, and could you introduce yourself?
Okay. Hi, my name's Samantha Quinn. I actually work or have worked on the border for the last 4 years for an institution that supports ORR and is a facility that takes unaccompanied children, or unfortunately titled unaccompanied alien children. So I'm pretty intimately familiar with this. Maria, my question was for you. First, I wondered, based on the policies that have recently, I guess, been both threatened and instituted by President Trump in regards to Mexico, do you think that at some point the amount of support we're getting from the Mexican government and preventing refugees from reaching the southern border is going to shift? And I say that because there were tariff threats for a long time which haven't actually been enforced, but at the same time there have been, other things that have been institutionalized that have kind of led the Mexican government to want to enforce immigration, limits throughout their own country. So do you think that might shift back down as like attention wanes? Or?
Sure. Well, let me backtrack a little bit, because I think it's important to know that we address two scenarios up here. We address the situation pertaining to unaccompanied children approaching the border, and also, being released here to a parent or legal guardian. And then we have the situation at the border where you have migrant families, kept south of the border in Mexico because of the migrant protection protocol, what we like to call Remain in Mexico protocol. So we're talking tens of thousands of people, including small children, now living in a number of situations at the border. And that includes living on the streets, living in civil society shelters, renting rooms where they wait for their hearing in the United States. Many of these families are living in cartel territory, which further compounds the complexity of serving them, providing them legal support, etc. So we're talking about children who are in that situation right now, where we're lacking the formal protection, humanitarian response infrastructure that would routinely be found in a refugee camp or in other more formally structured situations. So Mexico has yielded to the pressure, right? That is on a number of fronts, right? Trade related, also a rising sentiment, among the Mexican population that they're not prepared, or they don't want to take on the problem of this large number of migrants. Other more aggressive postures against migrants, and perhaps even xenophobic positions in places like Tijuana, where we saw in December. Is Mexico going to push back on that? I think is your question. Is it going to stand down a little bit? Yeah. Right now, I don't know what you think, Ashley. I'm not seeing it yet. What we're seeing is kind of a ramp up of the utilization of the National Guard, and continued pressure to really stop the flow at the southern border. Not sure what it will take at this point to make the shift for Mexico to say enough. I think as we continue to see repatriations, rapid repatriations, and the numbers continue to go down in Mexico, my fear is that the status quo will remain, but I don't know if, Ashley, you have additional thoughts?
So, yeah, during the Obama administration after the 2014, there was quite a bit of pressure that was placed on the Mexican government and Peña Nieto's government to do more enforcement and to outsource enforcement. And we did see, frankly, after a period of time, the numbers go back up. I think Maria's point is well placed. The Mexican government so far seems to be very much succumbing to the pressure. What I think is a different factor in this circumstance from post-2014 is that this administration has pressed neighboring countries, most notably Guatemala and El Salvador, to implement or at least sign, they're not calling them safe third country agreements, but by all sakes, we're seeing that they actually could be in implementation a safe third country agreement. These are still very much being contested, you know, in Guatemala. I don't think it's a done deal yet, but we do know that in some measures, some of these are going to start to be implemented. So I think even if Mexico were to kind of not be as aggressive, I think to Maria's point, you will see less individuals if these safe third country, by another name, agreements are fully implemented. It is expanding the reach, I think, of the enforcement apparatus outside of Mexico now to the Northern Triangle. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe outgoing Acting Secretary Macalinen did express a desire to actually execute more of these agreements, not just with the Northern Triangle, but perhaps south as well. This is, I think, a whole new dimension when we think about regional migration, and it will change the ability, I think, of the other countries to, frankly, be a deterrent for those reaching the U.S.-Mexico border.
Just to follow up on that, I wonder if you want to comment, is Mexico safe for Central American kids?
So I'll start. You know, I think we have to look, and I would love to hear your perspective, because you have done comparative. You know, we look at the infrastructure. United States, obviously, I'm up here saying kind of we'd like more post-relief services and home studies and legal services, but we do have a system that does address many children's needs. And during both the last administration and this administration was responsive to the bed needs, whether it was by a private contractor in a homestead facility or whether it was through other, you know, nonprofit efforts, was responsive. I don't think that Mexico has the infrastructure if we were to see a large number of unaccompanied children. I know that they, you know, DEEF is the Child Protection Agency. I think that they've certainly made improvements. I think that there's a long way to go, and there's certainly a large number of people coming at a time that improvements would be needed. So it's kind of building the airplane as you go. In comparison to the Northern Triangle countries, we know that they're much more established. I mean, so for example, the Guatemalan asylum system, I believe, has 5 or 8 full-time staff to deal with asylum. We're just not equipped to deal with what a safe third country agreement would bring.
That's right.
So I guess a big maybe.
I think, if I may,
Yes,
and then I just drawing from one of the recommendations that you made in regards to conducting best interest determinations for the children, we have been making a very concerted effort to build capacity in Mexico by working with DEEF. And in Mexico, the infrastructure, it's fairly new. The effort in learning how to serve unaccompanied minors is pretty nascent, but they do have a law in place for the welfare of children that requires that their child welfare agencies conduct best interest determinations of children in Mexican government custody. And that, it is interesting because here unaccompanied children are under the custody of ORR. In Mexico, DEEF has municipal offices, state offices, and federal offices, and they don't talk to each other, and there's no case management where you can at any given time obtain data on the number of unaccompanied children in Mexico. The number who have been processed for asylum is fairly low, in the hundreds. The number of children who've been repatriated is unknown. And the number of recurrent arrivals is also unknown. So we focused on outreach to DEEF, and they have been receptive. So there's some positive news. They have been receptive. We have now conducted at least 3 or 4 trainings in Mexico with DEEF on not just the U.S. system, best interest determination, child-friendly interviewing techniques, working with legal sponsors and potential legal sponsors, et cetera. There has been good reception, but not everywhere in Mexico. It is very inconsistent, and we constantly have to calibrate our advocacy to address local tensions. For example, the southern border with Guatemala, DEEF is very uncooperative. Same with the asylum agency, COMAR. The northern border in Tijuana, they've been very receptive. They've even accompanied children to the port of entry themselves. So it's a constant process of educating and re-educating and making new connections. Yeah.
Other questions? Margaret? Why don't you wait for the microphone?
Hello. Thank you so much for this great panel. I was wondering if you all have any suggestions for the Office of Refugee Resettlement to improve their practices. First, I'm curious about their ability to develop surge capacity or flexible capacity to deal with the varying numbers of children that come to prevent another homestead situation in the future. And then second, just general practices, and especially with their cooperation with perhaps some of the subcontractors like the Catholic Charities or the Lutheran Social Services in light of the Memorandum of Agreement with ICE particularly.
Do you want to introduce yourself, Margaret?
Oh, sorry, I'm Margaret Hodson. I was also on the trip to Sweden to study best practices, and I'm a research assistant at ISOM.
Suggestions for ORR?
Yeah, I can start. First off, I would say, so right now, despite it being a record year, fiscal year for the number of children, we are at a kind of lull in the unaccompanied children program in terms of the number that are in the U.S. government care. And the ORR leadership has been responsive to be always, I think, frankly, since 2014, regardless of the administration, preparing for the larger numbers. Bed space remains a constant issue. Frankly, that's how we got into the situation. The Obama administration opened up Homestead, and it's still around. It's actually on kind of a warm status right now. But what I will say is, you know, the best type of facilities, and your presentation talked about this, are the small-scale, community-based, shelter models. That being said, that's very hard to think about and cobble together when we're talking about literally 70,000 plus children coming through in a fiscal year. So I think that is a practice that we're always kind of working on, as well as being aware of larger institutional care, making sure that it is, to the extent possible, best interest kind of focus. One of the things I would say is, while we're in this moment of a lull, so to speak, of less unaccompanied children coming, I think it's a real moment of opportunity for ORR to look at improving some of its access to post-relief services, access to home studies. Some of those are mandated by the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization. Some of them just should occur for best interest kind of, family strengthening. And then I think also perhaps evaluating a renewed commitment to legal services, or at least the facilitation and strengthening of its partnership with the legal orientation program for custodians with the Department of Justice. These are all things that I think could be done that are best interest focused, but they're also in the U.S. taxpayers' interest, just to make the program focus more smoothly and function on a more flexible basis. The issue of influx housing remains an issue as long as we have large numbers of unaccompanied children coming. I know there are many in the grassroots who participated with Tornillo or Homestead and shut it down movements. We are actually working with KIND. It's our position that while we don't, prefer to use those facilities, we would rather see, frankly, the ability of OR to retain flexibility and, if necessary, use those facilities, because obviously they're better to have children in an ORR shelter than a Department of Homeland Security short-term shelter. But we are urging, and we're working, frankly, on engagement with Congress, that Congress should have more oversight of an influx facility. An influx facility is not temporary if it's been online since 2014 or 2015. If a facility has been online in ORR's network of facilities for that long, it's no longer a temporary facility. It needs to be subject to the ORR policy manual. It is subject to Flores, but it needs to be, frankly, given more oversight that Congress is well equipped to do. So I have a backgrounder on that, and I'm happy to connect with you more if you're interested afterwards.
Catherine.
Hello, thank you to everyone for speaking. I have a question for Lauren and for Morgan. In the work we've been doing in this last year about best practices, one of the findings I thought it might just be nice for you to speak a bit about is there are how do you define a best practice? But there is an example of South Africa, for example, where the policies that are in place are really, pretty remarkable. But the implementation of those policies, right, it's a story about the resources not matching with the policy, and therefore the implementation is weak. So I just thought maybe as a way to illustrate what we know about South Africa, maybe you could just speak off the cuff about that. And any other example of a country where the policy framework might be in place, because again, we're moving toward a best practice then.
Yeah, I can talk quickly about South Africa. So South Africa does have one of the most progressive refugee regimes in the world on paper, but unfortunately, this doesn't necessarily translate into practice, and it's kind of the question of if a country doesn't have the resources to provide good healthcare for its own citizens, how can it provide good healthcare for foreign-born refugee and migrant children? And so we also mentioned, for instance, the Ecuador's law on mobility, and that is another kind of case where the best practice is first changing the legal system, changing the legal precedent, because you have to have that before change can happen. But unless you have the resources to back that up, it's not going to necessarily play out on the ground. And that's unfortunately what we do see in South Africa. South Africa has a huge number of unaccompanied children. They come not necessarily seeking protection, but often they come to work because they're trying to support family back home. And so they don't want to enter the child protection system because they want to work. They don't want to be in school, which is obviously a really difficult balance if you're trying to protect them, but also consider their own autonomy. And so South Africa hasn't really figured out how to successfully protect these children, keep them from being exploited, and keep them in shelters because they don't want to be in shelters. So even though South Africa has a great legal system, on paper, these children should have equal rights to education and to healthcare, and they should be all assigned a guardian and legal representation. This really, we don't see this happening hardly at all. If anything, the best practices are thanks to the large base of NGOs that work in South Africa. And so they're really the ones that are have the resources to carry out these sorts of practices.
I think we had a question over here.
Hi, I'm Rafael. I'm a student in the Public Policy Masters. I had a question about what do we know about the experience of unaccompanied minors after family reunification, and I wonder if we have seen any patterns in their experience that is different or similar from the experience of children who have come through different methods to the US. I wonder if there has been any follow-up on their particular experience after going through the process that you explained.
I'll start, but I'm sure Maria has some, because KIND does do a lot of community work. So, we see reunification, again, we provide reunification services, and we have done follow-up kind of surveying. I think, to be honest with you, I think some of it also depends on where it is that you are reunified, what part of the country. Certainly it can affect your immigration outcomes, unfortunately, we have a wide variety of, immigration judges making decisions based on jurisdiction. But also, I think the ability of the family to access state services also affects the outcomes. A lot of times we've seen successful reunification. There are circumstances of family breakdown. And I would say when we think about family breakdown, what it is that has driven it, the two things I would say, one is a child who has lived either almost all or all of their life separated from a parent who's lived here in the United States and supported them. And maybe they lived in home country with a grandparent or an auntie or an extended family. And then they come here and mom or dad has maybe a new part of their family. And so that frankly can be a challenge sometimes, particularly if the children are older, they're teenagers. That can be sometimes difficult. How we remedy kind of looking at that, and a suggestion going back to this idea of integration services, is very much thinking about counseling and family strengthening activities. You may have observations on the legal side, just.
Sure. There was a question that was placed about whether the children were safe in Mexico, and I think it makes sense to respond to that as well in the context of this question, because the vulnerability, a lot of the children that we see in our offices, come already with the trauma of early separation from a parent, right? So that's trauma number one. Then they may have experienced violence, either sex and gender-based violence or gang-related violence or family violence, domestic violence, and a number of other traumatic events in their short lives. And that's coupled by the trauma that they endured throughout the journey, right? A lot of the children that we see have endured insurmountable, violent incidents and trauma throughout the journey. Sometimes have taken several journeys to try to make it to safety. In Mexico, for example, I interviewed a number of children recently who were in makeshift shelters that were unlicensed. And even in those shelters, they were being, 12, 13 years old, were being given drugs, there was a 15-year-old who was pregnant and who was exposed to media. You can see all her pictures online. So very little protocols for protecting children in some of these unlicensed shelters. Then they come here and they make it through the trauma of going into custody at CBP. They come prepared to survive the 2-3 days, sometimes as of this, for example, this summer where they were, in custody in CBP stations for prolonged, over the 72 hours. So all of that trauma compounds, and then they come here, and now they have to face this legal proceeding. When you travel with a parent, your parent usually, will be the lead person speaking for the family before an immigration court. When you sit in a shelter for upwards of 60 days, the pressure is different, right? You now have to understand this legal process. At the same time, there isn't an infrastructure post-release to receive the support that they need. So at KIND, we've made investments in building up our social services team. And we're finding that it is an essential piece of our service delivery to be able to help the children enroll in school where they still face insurmountable challenges, even in the US, to enroll in school, where we seek partnerships with medical providers, with psychologists and therapists who can serve the children. So those partnerships are also part of what we think is the best services model, and it's a good news story for us. For example, after family separation, we had the Association of Play Therapists come to us and say, we want to partner with KIND to provide play therapy. We understand some of your clients are now younger. And then the last thing I will share, because I know we're running out of time, is that remember some of these children are close to being 18. So there was a question about ORR practices. One ask I will make of ORR is that they engage more thoughtfully and intentionally and partner with us on post-18 planning, because in this administration, right now we're dealing with children who are coming in before they turn 18, and they're safe in a shelter, and then on their 18th birthday, they get picked up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they get transferred to adult custody. We have seen some best practices in the state of Washington, where we are partnering with community-based organizations such as the YMCA, who is liaising with OR, saying, we will take them. We'll take those kids when they turn 18. Let's keep them away from the streets. In Seattle, for example, we deal with homelessness, mental health issues. So even if we succeed in not getting them into ICE custody, or in them not going into ICE custody, then sometimes they end up in the streets. So lots of issues, a lot of children who don't have legal guardians. While the number of detained children seems to be going up, the number of children that we call Category 4 kids who don't have reasonable opportunities for reunification and stay in custody continues to go up. So there are some significant challenges that I think those kids face versus the children who come accompanied.
Maybe just a final question for anyone who'd like to jump in. I mean, if we want good immigration practices that deal with kids in a humane and rights-based way, but what about the causes? I mean, is there anything that could be done to stop the need for children to set out for journeys of thousands of miles? Should we be arguing for more economic aid to Central America or measures to confront the gang violence that's driving a lot of these movements?
Yeah, I would say that's a critical point, that the Trump administration over the past few months discussing slashing economic aid, particularly to the Northern Triangle countries, has really drastic effects, because if you imagine the metaphor of if you don't turn off the faucet, then the asylum seekers, particularly unaccompanied children, will keep fleeing the violence and the gang violence and the persecution that they face in their home countries. And so economic aid is really critical, that if we don't address the root causes of these problems, then we will continue to see the ramifications. And if you think about this in the long-term cost-benefit analysis, like investing in the root causes of the problem is probably much more fiscally sound than dealing with the ramifications for the years and decades to come.
I remember that the President of Mexico has called for a Marshall Plan for Central America to really mobilize an all-out effort to address some of these causes. But thank you all very much, and especially thanks for our panel.